Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to the public meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to review the Bill 1 Western Canada Lottery Act. And before we get started into the clause-by-clause review, I'll ask members of the committee to introduce themselves for the record, and I'll start with Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Danny McNeely, Saunty Region. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Welcome, Shane Thompson, Nahende.
Good afternoon. Michael Natalie, MLA for Detroit.
R.J. Simpson, MLA, Hay River North.
And I am Kieron Testart, member for Cam Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. Today, the committee is holding a public clause-by-clause review on Bill 1 Western Canada Lottery Act. I'll now invite the Honourable Carolyn Cochrane, Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs, to introduce herself and her staff for the record and proceed with any opening remarks that you may have. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon to everyone, the Chair, of course, and the members of the Standing Committee. I'm pleased to return today for the clause-to-clause review of Bill 1, Western Canada Lottery Act. Once again, I am accompanied by Mr. Ian Legari, Director of Sport, Recreation and Youth, and Ian Rennie from the Department of Justice. Also in the audience is Gary Shardy and Sherry Jarrock from the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs. I've been pleased with the exchange that's taken place with the Standing Committee since we last met to present this bill. Committee requested additional information from the Department and has presented 3 proposed amendments to the bill, to which the Department has concurred with these amendments. Before speaking to the formal amendments, I'll confirm that the Department has agreed to a process working through the Financial Management Board to establish an accumulated surplus and deficit for this special purpose fund. The 3 amendments to the bill include a motion related to annual reporting on the fund, including total paid, recipients of lottery funds, and the purpose for the disbursements they have received from the fund, and the closing balance of the fund, including accumulated surplus and deficit. This reporting is to be done within 90 days of the end of the fiscal year. A motion removing Clause 6, brackets 1, brackets E, which specifically allowed for disbursements related to hosting of multi-sport games, and a technical amendment adding a heading in Section 8 that was missing in the preparation of the bill. The Department on Friday provided committee written concurrence with the amendments as presented. I look forward to any further discussion on the bill today with committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. I'll now turn to committee. Does committee have any general comments or questions for the Minister before we begin the clause-by-clause review? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to thank the Minister for appearing today, and she mentioned in her opening remarks that she's going to work with the Financial Management Board on a surplus deficit policy for this particular fund. Is that something that can a draft of that policy be provided to committee for committee's review? Thank you.
Thank you. Because it's going through the Financial Management Board, we can bring forward the comments, the recommendation, but it is a decision paper from the Financial Management Board, so I can't make a commitment at this time, but I can put it in the submission to the FMB Financial Management Board that you would like a draft of it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I know committees had a fair bit of discussion about whether a motion might be the best way to deal with this, to amend the bill in some way, but I think the committee was okay with you, the commitment to develop a policy with FMB around this, but given that I think there has been some concerns expressed to committee about this issue, that it'd be helpful if you could commit to consult with committee in developing your FMB submission, or is that what you're, is that the sort of the path that you're looking at following? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the committee would like to have input into the drafting submission, then if you put that in writing, then we will consider that and take your advice in our submission. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Madam Minister, and I see Mr. Rowley has no further questions. This may be, I don't want to preempt the committee's report, but this is something the committee has considered and will be in further discussion with you, but we will be issuing a comprehensive report on Bill 1 that will go to the House, and we'll make a number of recommendations. As we mentioned during the last public hearing, there were a number of submissions from members of the public that were not, that were beyond the scope of the bill, but the committee takes those recommendations very seriously, and we want to give them the full attention of the Legislative Assembly. So when the report does come forward, it will address those public submissions and also this issue around financial reporting and funding arrangements. But we will defer discussion of those until the report is actually before us. But we expect your full participation and cooperation when we have our Committee of the Whole review. Anything further from committee on general comments or questions around Bill 1? Oh, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. During the hearing, at least one organization talked about what they considered to be onerous reporting requirements to MACA on the use of funding, and a lot of statistics around how many participants and age of the participants and that sort of thing. What does MACA do with that kind of data? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Minister, please introduce your official before he provides evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ian Legari will speak to the member's question. Thank you.
There may be a little bit of confusion with what the organization presented, because we're at the end of the first year of requiring that reporting right now. We look for basic financial information and basic participation information so that we can report on the use of those public funds. So it's not a detailed breakdown. In past years, through the Sport and Recreation Council and through Sport North, when they had authority to run the lottery, there were fairly detailed information requirements. We're not proposing to go down that road. Our idea is to make sure we have good information about how the monies were spent and how many people benefited. So it should be fairly comprehensive enough so that we can justify the use of the funds, public funds, but not onerous from the reporting perspective.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, is there some way you could just give us a bit of a summary of exactly what's asked in terms of, and it doesn't have to be here, maybe I can just get a commitment out of the minister that she'll provide that information as to what sort of information is collected as part of the funding arrangements and how the department uses it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we will commit to providing a detailed letter outlining the reporting requirements and the reasons why we have the requirements to Standing Committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. And Mr. Thompson, I will allow you to 5 minutes of time for the floor. Thank you.
Probably won't take 5 minutes. Just to clarify, it's going to be similar to the form or the reporting relationship you did with Sport and Rec funding, the youth contributions. Is that going to be similar in nature? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister?
I'm going to pass it on. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll let Ian Legari answer this question as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, it would be.
Thank you, Mr. Legari. So my understanding, and I guess my background for the last 23 years, this reporting relationship that I've seen in the past has been very not onerous at all. It's been very client-based. It's been very positive in getting required information that we needed. So I'm actually quite happy to see that the department has taken that step to get the reporting, and I think the people that are getting this funding will probably see some positive natures. And so I'd like to thank the department for looking at it, taking it that direction. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That would be my last comment.
Thank you, Minister. You may respond.
Thank you. I take that as a comment. I will carry it forward to the department, though, because it's always good to get good feedback sometimes. So anytime we get good comments, I take it back. So thank you again to the member.
Thank you, Madam Minister. All right, committee, we will move on to our clause-by-clause review of the bill. There are 11 clauses in this bill, so I'd allow members to turn to their copies of the legislation or the bill before us. Clause 1 begins on page 3. Committee to Clause 1. Does committee agree? Clause 2. Does committee agree? Clause 3. Does committee agree? Clause 4. Does committee agree? Clause 5. Does committee agree? Mr. O'Reilly.
I think this is where I do it, right? Yes. Just making sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 1 be amended by adding the following after subclause 5, bracket 4. Bracket 5, the minister shall, within 90 days following the end of each fiscal year, table a report of the fund with the Legislative Assembly, which indicates A, total amount paid into the fund in the preceding year, B, details of each disbursement from the fund, including the recipient, the amount paid, and a description of the purpose for the disbursement, and C, the value of the fund at the end of the preceding fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The motion is in order to the motion. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'll try to keep this brief. When committee held its public hearing, it heard from several representatives of the sports and recreation community and some others that there should be some greater transparency and accountability with regard to the fund itself and the use of the fund. And although this is to be a fund established through the Financial Administration Act, and their GNWT also has a planning and accountability framework, there is really no explicit requirements for this information to be made public on an annual basis. For example, in the public accounts. So there is for revolving funds, but this is not a revolving fund. So although the planning and accountability framework does apply, that particular framework doesn't require, say, an annual public disclosure of the money in, money out. So I think committee was of the view that tabling of an annual report in the House of money in, money out would accomplish the kind of accountability and transparency that the public is seeking and that the committee itself is seeking. And we understand that the minister is prepared to accept that as a friendly amendment, and we look forward to moving forward with the bill. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Anything further to the motion? Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I stated in the past and will state here, I support this amendment, mostly because disclosure of positive benefits to the sporting community is the right thing to do. We've got quite an active youth team in Fort Good Hope, and they've taken the cup here a couple of times. And if we're going to disclose the transportation costs of these young individuals, that's, to me, is positive news. And it should be shared with the public on where their public funds are going. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. To the motion. The question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the minister does concur with the amendment. It's important for us to be as transparent and accountable as possible with our government structure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cochrane. To Clause 5 as amended. All those in favor? Thank you, committee. Clause 6, Mr. Simpson.
Mr. Chair, I move that subclause 6.1 of Bill 1 be deleted and the following substituted. 6.1, the minister may make disbursements from the fund for A, the promotion and delivery of physical activity, sports and recreation programs, B, the development of coaching, C, the support of high-performance athletes, D, the payment of costs, expenses, and other liabilities incurred by the commission under this act, E, disbursements to the government of Nunavut in accordance with any agreement with the government of Nunavut made under paragraph 2.2A or 3.5D, and F, any other purpose that the minister deems necessary for the support or advancement of physical activity, sport, and recreation in the Northwest Territories.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. The motion's in order. To the motion, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The delivery of sport and rec programming in the NWT is dependent upon the commitment of volunteers as well as the funding provided by the GNWT and private sponsors. This is why the committee is concerned that the inclusion of multi-sport games funding under subclause 6.1 paragraph E of the bill opens the door to a reduction of the multi-sport game funding currently provided by the department, which could eventually result in such funding being relegated to the lottery fund, which would result in an overall reduction of the amount of funding available for youth sport and rec. This concern is exemplified by MACA's 2018-19 budget, which shows a reduction in the department's appropriation for multi-sport funding from $650,000 in 2016-17 to $250,000 in 18-19. The committee feels strongly that the bill should, well, I feel strongly that the bill should be amended by deleting subclause 6.1 paragraph E, thereby deleting multi-sport games as being automatically eligible for funding from the Western Canada lottery proceeds. The purpose of the proposed amendment is to signal that multi-sport activities will be funded first and foremost from the department's budget. And I think it's important that we make clear that this amendment does not prevent the minister from exercising the authority to supplement multi-sport game funding from the lottery fund. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. To the motion, Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. To the motion, I agreed with this in conversation with the committee. I strongly, as you heard in my member statement and also in the MACA's budget, this is an area that I don't think we should be doing. We shouldn't be taking money out of the department for multi-sport games and using lotteries for it. I know that the presentation, we've seen it 4 times that they use money since 2009. And I think this amendment is actually a better solution, and it pushes, the department has to look first and foremost within their budget before making that decision. So I think this is a good amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. O'Reilly, to the motion.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm on public record already as not supporting the department's move to cut its multi-sport game funding internally. It's an appropriation that it gets through the annual budgeting process. And I think by continuing to leave that in here as an explicit purpose to the fund, that will just open the door further. The minister still has the authority under 6.1F of the amendment to make use some of the lottery funds for support of the multi-sport games, but the minister has to make it a clear, conscious determination that that's a good use of funds. So, and I expect that that sort of decision would be disclosed in the annual report that's going to be tabled in the House. So I support the motion. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Minister, do you concur with this amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I concur with the amendment, and I do want to express gratitude to the committee for allowing us to be able to supplement with this fund as necessary, because although I know that currently all cabinet is in favor of multi-sport games, it's you never know what's going to happen 20 years down the road. So I like that it would come out first from our budget. We could look for supplementary funding, and if all fails, that we actually have some leeway to make sure that these games go forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Committee to Clause 6 as amended. All those in favor? Thank you. All right, committee, moving on to Clause 7. All those in favor? Thank you. Clause 8, all those in favor? Sorry, Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 1 be amended by inserting the following heading immediately after Clause 8, the word liability. It's before Clause 8.
Sorry, can you just clarify the motion for the committee, please?
Okay, Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 1 be amended by inserting the following heading immediately after Clause 8. Immediately before Clause 8. The word liability.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McNeely. So just to clarify, the motion is that you move that Bill 1 be amended by inserting the following heading immediately before Clause 8. Is that correct, Mr. McNeely?
Before.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. McNeely.
You want me to read it again?
No, Mr. McNeely. Did you want to speak to the motion?
No, Mr. Chair, I'm just gonna add for the record, it's a housekeeping item.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McNeely. To the motion, committee? Question's been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Minister, do you concur?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur with it, and I sincerely thank the committee. If the heading wasn't put under, it kind of looked like the protecting the commission and the staff would be an offense or a punishment, and that is not the intent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Madam Minister, to Clause 8 as amended. All those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. The Clause 8 is amended. And to Clause 9. Does committee agree to Clause 9? Clause 10, does committee agree? Clause 11, does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Does the committee agree that Bill 1, Western Canada Lottery Act, is now ready for consideration in committee of the whole as amended? Mr. Natalie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 1, Western Canada Lottery Act, as amended and reprinted, be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in committee of the whole.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. Motion is in order. Motion is on the floor. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Bill 1, Western Canada Lottery Act will be reported to the Assembly as ready as, the Western Canada Lottery Act as amended and reprinted will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in committee of the whole. Thank you, Minister, and thank you to your officials, and thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. I'll ask the Minister and her officials to excuse themselves. Committee has other business that has been determined in camera. Yeah. I'll ask for a motion to move in camera from a committee member. Mr. Simpson?
Camera, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Motion's in order. All those in favor?
Agreed.
Thank you. Committee, we're now in camera.